Today we're going to talk about a particular topic that has been of interest to me for off and on because of it coming up from time to time as you interact with people, and people make statements that have always intrigued me, so it brings up a question that we'll answer today. And that is a question that I'm posing to you as we begin. Are you religious or are you spiritual? Are you religious or are you spiritual? If somebody were to ask you that, how would you respond? Well, as we go through the topic, I'll try to explain why we would ask this question and the importance of our answer, because it does impact, our organization, and it does impact us personally. And it's always been interesting. The reason this has come up because I meet people, and people will make the comment that their relative or their grandmother or their mom or their dad was so spiritual. And I'm like, what does that mean? And so it's always intrigued me. We see, if you are familiar with a certain group and their approach to religion, they'll have people that'll be there that look kind of pious, and they've got their fingers together in a certain configuration, and that's to represent piety, and they're spiritual. And I'm not sure holding your fingers like that's the key to that whole question. And I pose this question because some of the answers that people give when they're asked this are interesting. One person said, I am spiritual, but I was raised a Lutheran where I had to go to Sunday school, catechism, and church that I now believe was religion. I now belong to a church so my son could get baptized and go to Sunday school. I want him to have some religious background, but if it were not for my son, I would not belong to a church. I believe in God and have my own religion. I don't know how else to put it. Religion and spirituality are two separate things. I worship God wherever by myself. Another person said, most definitely leaning towards spiritual. Too many contradictions and nonsense in all the organized religions. And think about this in your personal situation and with people you know. And I would say we all know people outside the organization who feel the same way. Organization is just not for them. And in fact, they feel it's completely unnecessary. Another person answered the question this way: I am spiritual first. I'm a spiritual being and try and channel into that realm. Now, okay, you're spiritual, but when you mention that word channeling, I begin to be a little bit wonder about that, because that's a new age term, and usually you're channeling what? Sometimes you're channeling the wrong spirit. Another, I am neither spiritual nor religious. Another said, I'm neither, but I understand the difference. A person can be spiritual, but not necessarily religious. For example, you might believe in God, but don't subscribe to any religion like Christianity or Judaism. You have your own set of beliefs. But maybe you don't attend church or temple and don't read the Bible. I know plenty of people who believe in God but don't follow any of the teachings of any specific religion. Now, I doubt that any of us would subscribe to, that would describe any of us, what we've read here so far. But what's interesting to see is an increasing number of people all around the world who see things from this perspective. It's a growing number of people. A person can be spiritual, but not religious. I can believe in God, but I don't have to be a part of any religion. But as you think about that, isn't that religion? Isn't that a religion, that point of view? One person said, I'm spiritual. I think religion will be the downfall of man and is the true evil in this world. That's one perspective. Another said, I'm spiritual. I see a vast difference between religion and spirituality. Religion requires rules, money,
leaders, some sort of Bible they go by, and the proclamation that they are the only true path to God. Spirituality is simple, a quest for knowledge, enlightenment, and awareness. And it's quite interesting how people contrast religion and spirituality. And these are perspectives that are quite modern. These are the perspectives of people around you today. Two more, and then we'll get down to business here. We're all spiritual by our very nature. You can't become spiritual. It's just something that's natural. It's just what we are at the core. Religiousness is a structure of your spirituality, if you so choose. The structure to me is oftentimes a distortion of what real spirituality is. You don't need a structure, but many choose one. Religiousness is more chosen by mainstream or consensus thinking folks. In other words, if you can't really think for yourself, then you're one of those people that needs religion. You need that structure because you can't think for yourself. Another final one here, I would say I'm spiritual. Though to tell you the truth, I've been sort of searching what that means with no rule book to go by. I have read about different religions and connect with some things about several. I read this somewhere. I think it was on the Oprah website. When different spiritual leaders were polled about what spirituality meant to them, they said, be grateful, be yourself, meditate, be kind and loving, be in the moment, be open. I agree with that. So I'd like to discuss with you today, are you personally religious or spiritual? Are you one or the other, or are you both? And does it matter? Or are you neither? I'm not religious, I'm not spiritual. Does it even matter? What makes this subject interesting is that a lot of people, as I said, are talking about this. So where do we fit in? Where do we fit in? What should we understand about this? Can we agree with people that say, I would rather be spiritual than religious? Or can we agree with those who say they'd rather be religious than spiritual? Which one should we be, or should we be both? Now, to help us take a look at this, I'm going to be quoting from some research by a fellow by the name of George Barna. His group is involved in research into modern Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, and they've tried to look at the spiritual state of our nation. So they've interviewed a lot of people, taken surveys from a lot of people, and come to certain conclusions about religion, especially Christianity in America. They've interviewed thousands of individuals in order to come up with 4 different themes or summary statements that they think are indicative of where our country is at this particular time. And as we go through the data, it'll help us to see some things about the question, are you religious or are you spiritual? The first theme is this: increasingly, Americans are more interested in faith and spirituality than Christianity. People are more interested in faith and spirituality than in Christianity. Mr. Barna would looked at this from a different perspective than we would look at it, because he's very concerned about modern Christianity. He is a Christian, an evangelical Christian, and that's where he's coming from, and he is wondering why the world is getting away from what has always been seen as Christianity. And so there was a time in the Church of God, as we dealt with the subject of questions, we would ask people, should you keep the Passover, or should we keep Easter? And that's an important issue, and we would contrast the two. We know we should keep Passover. People say we keep Easter, and then we would explain to them why we keep Passover and why that Easter is not anything biblical. But more and more people, as you deal with them, you know what? They don't keep Easter. Easter is not even a question. So how do you address with them the question of
Easter when it's a non-question for them. So what all of this is telling us is that we have to approach things from a different point of view. Easter's not a question. Christmas is not a question. Those aren't big issues to them. So what we've got to do is we've got to tell them, approach it from the perspective, there is a God, and that God has given us the Scriptures, and that God instructs us in those Scriptures how we are to live. You can't go with one, juxtaposing their view with the biblical view. You can't do that because the world has changed, and people are spiritual. So you're going to have to deal with them as spiritual and less religious than what they've normally been. So our arguments with them have to be different. They are different. George Barna writes this: faith remains a hot topic in America these days. Politicians, athletes, cultural philosophers, teachers, entertainers, musicians, nearly everyone has something to say about faith, religion, spirituality, morality, and belief. But as the fundamental values and assumptions of our nation continue to shift, so do our ideas about faith and spirituality. Many of our basic assumptions are no longer firm or predictable, and that's what we're finding. You have to deal with people who don't buy what the Bible has to tell them. You're going to have to come at them from a completely different perspective. One of those assumptions relates to how we develop our faith. These days, the faith arena is a marketplace where ideas, beliefs, relationships, habits, rituals, and traditions that make immediate sense to us and with which we are comfortable. And most Americans, while they might attend a church, basically have the concept of a spiritual buffet. There's this huge spiritual buffet, and what you can do is you can go out and you can pick and choose those things that you want to believe. I know that when I took a class in comparative religion when I was in college, I think it may have been my second year, the guy that was teaching the class, and this was not at Ambassador College, but Christianity was part of it, and Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism and all of that. All of these religions were involved. And he comes strolling in his tie and his coat with his flip-flops on, which in 1970 was way off the charts. This guy was really hip. And his hair was cut in a certain way. It was short, kind of cropped short. And he talked, and he was his voice was quite irritating, but he let us know that he was a Buddhist with Hindu leanings, which I thought, okay, this guy, thinking about what people think about a spiritual buffet, he obviously felt it was a spiritual buffet, and he could take a little of this and a little of that and put it all together. So that's the world in which we live. Anything that doesn't fit, that you just say, that's not me. I don't agree with that. That may be my church, but that's not me. The idea of a spiritual buffet from which we can pick and choose is not found in the Scriptures. That may be a surprise to you. It's not in the Scriptures that we can just pick and choose what we want. Well, I'm going to go with 3 of the commandments, and then I'm going to do Pentecost, and then I'm going to do this. That's not in there. That's not in there. Now, people believe that, and people do that, but that's not in the Bible. Barna continues, the notion of associating with a particular faith, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or some other strain, still has some appeal because that connection provides a discernible identity and facilitates the possibility of belonging to something meaningful. So people still want to belong to a church because it gives them a sense of purpose, and they belong to something that's structured, that is a positive thing for them. But for many people, the actual components of what we choose to belong to are driven by our momentary need and perception. It's what I need right now, what I perceive I need right now. That's a fancy way of saying what we've often said in the Church of God,
is this: most people are involved with religious groups for the social aspect. Remember, one of the people I quoted, she had her son attending the Lutheran church because she wanted him to be baptized. She wanted him to have friends. She wanted him to have some religious background and be baptized. But if she didn't have the son and did not want that for him, then she wouldn't be attending there. She'd be doing her own thing. But for her son's sake, that's what she did. It's a great illustration of Barna's research. We go out of convenience. We go based upon what we can get from it. So in that sense, a lot of people are involved in religion because of it's largely consumer driven. It's driven by what they can get. It's like you drive in and you get what you can get and then go home. A couple attended a church that was involved in a great controversy in their church. The great controversy was this: whether to set aside a part of the church for a coffee bar. And there was a great controversy in the church about this, whether they should spend the money and they should set it up just like a Starbucks in order that they could offer coffee to their parishioners. And that was especially the case because they wanted to reach the young people, and the young people drink a lot of coffee. So this church had this situation going on and about whether they should set up a coffee bar because they would reach more young people, I guess. And they wanted to have the right stools and the right tables and all of that thing. If you've been to a coffee bar, that's all set up a certain way, and that's the way they wanted to set it up. And people felt, let's do this because we can reach a lot of people. And obviously, we have a high bar for our coffee here in the church hall. And all we need to do is get some chairs and pull them up there, and we'll have our own Starbucks. But anyway, the purpose of faith for most Americans is not so much to discover truth or to relate to a loving, praiseworthy deity as to become happy, successful, comfortable, and secure. For a growing percentage of citizens, their sense of spirituality more than Christianity facilitates those outcomes. In other words, they go to church and they tell themselves, I don't believe a thing they teach here because I'm spiritual, not religious, but, it's kind of a good social occasion and fills certain things in my life. So an increasing number of people who actually attend churches don't describe themselves as religious. They describe themselves as spiritual. So how important is that designation spiritual? Well, we'll see shortly. Barna goes on to say some of the related survey results cited from this year's study included most self-identified Christians are comfortable with the idea that the Bible and sacred books from non-Christian religions all teach the same thing. So the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and the other religious books all teach the same thing. They all teach the same principles, the same values. Now, half of all adults argue that a growing number of people they know are tired of having the same church experience, so they're happy to hear that. They can look at all these other religious ideas and concepts found in other books. And this is the mindset of people around us. They don't see there is one holy book to which they should look. And we see it from that perspective, but we have to realize that's not how the world sees it, which is kind of a shock for me and probably for you as well. The second theme that Barna identified is this: faith in the American context is now individual and customized. And this is more of this concept of the buffet. The idea that I might attend the Lutheran church, but I don't believe in Lutheran doctrine. I may not even practice what the Lutherans say should be practiced, but I'm customizing it for myself. I'm customizing what I believe. Americans are comfortable with an altered spiritual experience as long as they can participate in shaping that spiritual experience. He goes on, now that we are comfortable with the idea of being spiritual as opposed to being devoutly Christians, Americans typically draw from a broad treasury of moral, spiritual, and ethical sources of thought to concoct a uniquely personal brand of faith. So they put all of this together and they come up with their own brand, this smorgasbord which they put on their plate. And so if a person wants to sit and burn candles and hum various mantras, that's perfectly okay. That's being spiritual. If yoga is what you need to become spiritual and be a good person, then so be it. If you get that out of your Christian church, fine. If you want to believe in no God whatsoever, that's fine too. One person wrote, I am a deeply religious atheist. And his point, I'm very religious about spirituality, but you don't have to have a God to be spiritual. Now, that's an interesting concept. It's absolutely wrong, but it is, how people feel and how people think. Barna says, feeling free from the boundaries established by the Christian faith and immersed in a postmodern society which revels in participation, so participation is very important. Personal expression is very important. Satisfying relationships is very important. And authentic experience is quite important. We have become our own unchallenged spiritual authorities, defining truth and reality as we see fit. Have you ever heard of that concept before in the Bible? You have. The Bible doesn't promote it, but it is in there. It's found in the book of Judges. It says, there was no God in Israel, and everybody did that which was right in their own eyes. So everybody said, I've got my own religious beliefs, my own religious way of doing things, and they were doing it. So they're deciding for themselves. And that statement is important to realize. It's a very important statement in our current world. We have become our own unchallenged spiritual authority. And that's how many people approach things religious or spiritual or however you want to call it. And there is really no right and wrong, that there is no standard. We just want to be good people. We want to be nice people. And whatever we do with that is fine. Consequently, more and more people are engaged in a hybrid faith, mixing elements from different historical eras and divergent theological perspectives. In some ways, we are creating the ultimate ecumenical movement where nothing is deemed right or wrong. All ideas, beliefs, and practices are assigned equal validity. In other words, if you want to pray to the Great Spirit, sit in your wigwam and smoke peyote as part of being spiritual, there's nothing wrong with that. You're being spiritual. You're doing it your own particular way. You're being spiritual, aren't you? Barna says pragmatism and relativism rather than any sort of absolutism has gained momentum. That is to say, what works for me now is what's important, not what is true, what is right, what is absolute. Some of the key findings relating to this theme are interesting. 71% said they would develop their own slate of religious beliefs rather than accept a package of beliefs promoted by a church or denomination. So that means, so how are you going to reach these people and tell them these are all our fundamental beliefs when they're coming from a spiritual vantage point that I pick and choose what my fundamental beliefs are. I don't accept yours. I may accept one, I may accept two, but I'm not going to go with all of that. That's the world we're dealing with now. We'll decide for ourselves, we'll pick and choose what we like. And it may have a little of this and that and the other thing. It was also found that 75% of adults believe that God is motivating them and others to connect with Him through different means and experiences than were common in the past. So they would see that their God is reaching them in different ways. You know, I found God through practicing Hinayana yoga. And that's how I was able to become at one with Brahman. That's how I see God. People see these different paths all leading to God. 64% of adults are willing to experience or express their faith in new or different environments or structures than they have in the past. And I know that people feel this way. And back in 1969, when I began college, this whole trend was beginning. But I wasn't into that trend even at that point. I didn't know anything about the church, but I remember sitting in a circle with several other students who had been assigned to a long-haired math teacher by the name of Don Steele. So we're there with Mr. Steele, and we're talking about all different things, and then we're going to begin touching and all of this, and I'm like, well, you know what? I'm out of here. So I did not go back and participate in that group. And some of you who know me would probably understand why. When they mentioned the subject of touching, no wonder he left. But anyway, yeah, it's just touchy-feely, and I just couldn't see it. I didn't get it. Still don't get it. But other people do. And the other people stayed, and they all participated in this, and that was on the leading edge of things. And we have gone far beyond that, and the leading edge is way out there, way beyond what it was back in 1969. And people accept a lot of things that they never would have accepted before. In fact, only one third of people calling themselves Christians believe in absolute moral truth. That means 60% of them don't believe there is absolute moral truth. 75% of the people around us, they believe that these things constantly shift depending on circumstances. That means the Bible shifts. It's not necessarily always the same. It depends on circumstances. It's all relative. So what was applicable back in Paul's time is most assuredly not applicable today. For instance, I'm reading a book about the Bible and the sword, which is about the establishment of Israel in Palestine. And one of the things the person brings up is the Puritans. And the Puritans sought to establish God's kingdom on the earth, and the Puritans were completely nuts because they wanted to take all of these Old Testament principles, like the Ten Commandments, and begin to live by them. How crazy is that? And people look back on them as completely crazy. But we're all thinking, wait a minute, isn't that what we believe and what we're looking forward to? And wouldn't it make a great transformation in the world? It would. But that's seen as crazy. So it's interesting. A third theme about American culture is this: Bible literacy is neither a current reality nor a goal. People aren't interested in being biblically literate. People aren't interested in being biblically literate. In other words, most people, when they're told they don't know much about the Bible, are perfectly comfortable with that. So what? So what? They don't feel a need to know more about the Bible. And that's something we have to realize. People aren't interested in the Bible like they once were. Barna's findings related to biblical knowledge indicate that little progress, if any, is being made toward assisting people to become biblically literate. Bible reading has become the religious equivalent of soundbite journalism. You just get the little soundbite, that's all you get. So that relates to reading the Bible this way. You open up the Bible, you do the chance method. You take a section of the Bible and you flip it open and you read a passage, and then you're either inspired or you're not. Or you just say, well, that didn't move me. So you just shut the Bible and go on your way. Or, man, that was inspiring. Well, you're just doing a hit or miss kind of a thing, is how many people approach Bible study. So it's people are not digging into the Scriptures to seek to understand them more fully. There's a shockingly little growth in people's understanding of the fundamental themes of Scripture, and amazingly little interest in deepening their knowledge and application of biblical principles. They're not worried about knowing biblical principles, nor applying them. Now, this is not everybody in the world around us, but it's the majority. Those things aren't important. An example, an important preacher of our day is right here in Houston. He meets at the Lakewood Church right off of 59. And he makes no bones about caring about doctrine. Doctrine is not important. It's not important at all. He says his primary job is to make people feel good. And he will quote from the Bible, but only as it helps people feel good. And to feel good about their religion. It's not a matter of right or wrong, true or false, biblical or not biblical, but how do you feel about it? How do you feel about it? Well, our feelings are important, but only in support of fact. Our feelings are fickle, but fact is what we're searching for. That's what we need in order to underpin our feelings. Barna noted that some of the critical assumptions of many preachers and Bible teachers is inaccurate. The problem facing the church is not that people lack a complete set of beliefs. The problem is they have a full set of beliefs in mind which they think are consistent with biblical teachings. And they are neither open to being proven wrong nor learning new insights. They don't want to learn. And our research suggests that this challenge initially emerges in late adolescence or in early teen years. By the time most Americans reach the age of 13 or 14, they think that they know pretty much everything of value in the Bible. Everything the Bible has to teach, and they are no longer interested in learning more scriptural content. So when you're 13 or 14, you've got it down. You don't need more. And that's the common belief. They must be smarter than I was when I was 13 or 14. Now, I thought I knew everything, but when you challenged me on the Bible, it was pretty much the null set. There was not much in there. And thankfully, I was led to see how little I knew and how much I had to learn, and I still have to learn. Some of the survey results that led Barna to his conclusions included the following. Just 50% of all self-identified Christians firmly believe the Bible is totally accurate in all the principles that it teaches. That's just 50% of people believe it's totally accurate in the principles it puts forward. All you have to do is look at the current issues. How many people believe that certain things we know that are biblically prohibited are acceptable? A large percentage do believe that. How are you going to reach them? 27% of adults are confident that Satan exists. That means almost 75% don't believe he exists. And less than 40% of self-identified Christians firmly accept the teaching that a person can be influenced by spiritual forces such as angels and demons. So most people, they don't believe they can be impacted by angels and demons. Do you see why the prince of the power of the air would be so effective? They don't even believe that he's there or that he can be effective. 81% of self-identified Christians contend that spiritual maturity is achieved by following the rules of the Bible. And yet they don't know much about the Bible. And they say spiritual maturity comes from the Bible, but they don't care to learn about it. And does this have an impact on how we will shape the preaching of the gospel to the world? It does. We've got to find a way to reach them based upon where they're at. That's what the Apostle Paul did as he went to them. He did not go to the Jews and have to convince them about dietary laws, about whether to keep the Sabbath, about whether to keep the holy days. Those were non-issues with them. So what did he have to preach to them? That's where they were at, so he had to preach to them what they needed to understand, which was crucial to expand their understanding, which was Jesus Christ crucified. So he took that message to them, and most Jews were not real happy about hearing that. So let's look at the fourth theme, and then we'll move on to some practical application. The fourth theme identified by Barna in his surveys was this: effective and periodic measurement of spirituality is not common at this time and is not likely to become common in the future. In other words, what he's saying is, how do you measure spirituality? There's no measure for that. There's no measure for spirituality. You know, if somebody says, I'm spiritual, how do you measure that? How do you measure that? You know, somebody says, I'm very spiritual, so how do you rate that? You're not just spiritual, you are very spiritual. How do you rate that? I don't know. But it is interesting that God has given us a measure. And he said, I want you to measure yourself regularly. In fact, I want you to take a very intense evaluation, make a very intense evaluation every year in order to find out where you are at. God designed a system where we measure ourselves. And we're to do so on an ongoing basis, but very specifically at Passover time. So if you're going to evaluate someone or something, you have to have a standard. You have to have a way of measuring. And if somebody says, I'm spiritual, I don't know how you measure that. That's their opinion. They're telling me that, but how do you measure it? So you have to accept that, I guess, if that's the case, there is no measure. Everyone is spiritual. And whatever they do that's spiritual is perfectly acceptable. Everything has equal validity. And how dare you be critical of them? Barna points out that there are two ways to measure. You can either do it externally by pastors or teachers or coaches or peers, and there is self-evaluation. And we all know, as I said, that we have a self-evaluation process that correlates with Passover. Currently, there is very little in the way of a review of a person's spiritual condition. When pastors look at the church, they will almost 9 out of 10 of them will say people are not spiritual. They are lacking, and one of the things is they see that as a problem for the whole church and all churches except theirs. Their congregation is fine, but everybody else's churches, they're lacking, and they need to really evaluate themselves. And when they do evaluate their congregations, what do they evaluate them on? Participation. They don't evaluate them based on their spiritual knowledge and their application of that knowledge. They base them on participation. And participation is a good thing, and it's important. But you know what? When it really comes down to it, that's going to be a secondary issue as God evaluates us. He's going to say, you were a good participant, but more than anything, he's going to say, were you living it? That's how he's going to measure us, and there is a measurement that's going on, and some of that we'll be getting to in the not-too-distant future. So as we look at ourselves, we're going to get personal now. Are we spiritual, or are we religious, and does it matter whether we're one or the other? Are we spiritual, or are we religious? And religious must mean, from the world's perspective, must mean involvement in a church, strict rules, being told what to do. And spiritual means being kind, being nice, good to the earth and other people. You don't kick dogs or cats. But let's define religious. Webster's has 3 definitions, which as you'll see, prove helpful. The first definition is this: relating to or manifesting faithful devotion to an acknowledged ultimate reality or deity. That is, faithful devotion to God. That's one definition. A second definition is this: of or relating to or devoted to religious beliefs or observances. Most of us would hope that a religious person would have faithful devotion to God in beliefs and observances. And the third one is scrupulously and conscientiously faithful. That is, they are fervent, they are zealous. And we might use this definition if we were to say, I exercise religiously, faithfully. You do it every day for a certain amount of time. So the question, should we be religious based on these definitions? And more importantly, what do the Scriptures say? Let's go to Deuteronomy and look at chapter 6 and verse 5. So when you look at people, whether they're religious or not, they're all over the place. And if you look at the subject of being spiritual, that's all over the place too. And you can see why there's so much confusion and problems in our world. God answers the question whether we should be religious or not. Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." You're to love God with every fiber of your being. And how does God know if you love Him? How do you show that you love God? Easy definition is one Christ gave us: keep my commandments. The commandments are love in action. They're your faith in action. So God says here, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. They're to be a part of your very being. Part of your very being. And he says, these are things that we are to have as a part of us. And they're not just to be a part of us, but what about our family? Verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children." Your children, I'm sure, are precious to you, and they are precious to God. And God said, I want you to live your values, and I want you to impart by word and deed those values to your children. You are to teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. From the beginning of the day till the end of the day, they're to be a part of your life and manifested in your life, in all of your interactions with your family and everybody in the community. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. So whatever your hand finds to do, you're to do it with your might, and it's to be guided by your relationship with God. "And they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." They're to be, your mind is to be focused upon those truths. "You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." So when you go out of the house or you come into the house, they're part of your life. When you go out your door, when you go out your gates, and you go out into the community, God's truth is a part of your life. So, looking at that, I wonder, does God want us to be religious? And as you look at this and you conclude what it has to say, it says everything that we do and see will be impacted by the relationship that we have with God. Should we be religious? Absolutely. Let's go to Joshua chapter 22. Joshua chapter 22. So these aren't the only scriptures that emphasize this. These are just a select few that help to make the point. Joshua 22, verse 5. So as we read this, we might ask ourselves if Joshua was asking for faithful devotion to an acknowledged deity. Is he? Let's see. Verse 5. "But take careful heed to do the commandments and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." Is he asking us to be faithful, to be faithfully devoted to an acknowledged deity? I would have to conclude that that's exactly what he's asking, that we would be faithful to that deity. He says here that we're to love our God, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all of our heart. And God clearly expects us to be religious, to be fully devoted to Him. He's telling us that God has given us instructions that are not a smorgasbord. It's not just some smorgasbord. He's put the food on our plate and asked us to eat of it. We don't get the option of picking and choosing from different religious tenets to create our own religion. What Joshua is speaking of is something outside of that thinking. It doesn't agree with the world, and the world looks at this and sees, man, that is so rigid. We're looking at boundless freedom to do whatever we want. We can be Christian, Buddhist, we can be all kinds of things, and isn't that better? And God said, no. I've given you the path, that straight and narrow path, that I want you to be devoted to, because you will be blessed as you do it. You'll be blessed, your children will be blessed, and everybody you come into contact with will be blessed. So the teachings about being religious are also found in the New Testament. And Jesus Christ tells us what's most important. Let's go to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. So we've seen the principles mentioned in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. But Christ came up with some completely new principles that have no relationship to the Old Testament. Let's see this. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. Jesus said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind." Wait a minute. Didn't we just read that back in Deuteronomy and in Joshua? You mean Christ is not giving us something completely new? Something that's just lovey-dovey? Where we're just nice to everybody? We're just spiritual? Christ said we're to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. And basically, you know what Christ is telling us? We're to be religious zealots. And when I say that, we begin to think, that's kind of like being like ISIS. We're going to go and blow people up and all that. That's not what we're talking about. You're zealous for it. You're zealous for it, and you know what? You basically give off that vibe that I am a Christian. Not better, but that I have a meaning, I have a purpose, I understand how I'm to live, and I'm dedicated to living it. And I'm going to live it. And nothing's going to stop me because I love God with all of my heart, mind, and soul, and I'm seeking to love you as my neighbor. And I'm willing to put the principles that I've learned into practice as I relate to you. Let's go to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, which I would say these passages, which we read at baptismal time, these passages are most assuredly pointing us toward our need to be religious. Pointing to our need to be religious and devoted to the ultimate deity. Verse 26. It says, "If anyone comes to me," that is, if we make a commitment to Jesus Christ and to God the Father, "and we do not hate our father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters," that is, we love them less by comparison, "and yes, and my own life also, he cannot be my disciple." God the Father and Jesus Christ have to be first and foremost in our life, and everything else, our family, our friends, our jobs, whatever it may be, has to be secondary. And you have to look at that. That is extreme. That is seen as extreme. But that's what God said. You're devoted to me. You made a commitment to me. And that is being faithfully devoted to God, putting him first. And it's not something that you can hide if you really believe it and are living it. Verse 27, it says, "And whosoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." So when we make that commitment, we take on a burden and we have to carry it. We made a commitment to carry it. And we go down to verse 33. And it says, "So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple." We have to forsake it all and put God first. When the definition of religious speaks of relating to or devoted to religious beliefs or observances, does that apply to us as well? It certainly does. We might say that religious has to do with our outward display of what's going on internally. People can see our religion. They can't necessarily see what we are spiritual, if we're spiritual, but they can see our religious practices and our devotion to that religion. And so religious might be said to be our outward expression when it comes to being devoted to religious beliefs and observances. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Here Paul says, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some." So, what is he talking about? He's talking about coming to Sabbath services, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. We exhort each other, we encourage each other. We don't just come to church for ourselves. Yes, we come to learn, but we come to fellowship, and you know what? You have made a commitment to God the Father, and you made a commitment to His body, the body of Christ. The people here who have made a commitment to Christ, that made that same Luke 14 commitment that I made and you made and we all made, we all became a part of the body of Christ. And as a part of the body of Christ, what we do affects everybody else. So my coming to church doesn't matter. I can come hit or miss. You got to think about that, because God says, hey, wait a minute. I put you into my body. And you made a commitment to love and care for my body, to honor me and to love and care for my body. So when you say, God, I'm not going to show up, I'm tired, I don't need to do this, how's that? You just have to step back and think, does it fit with the commitment? Verse 24 says to stir up one another. And you know what? You can't stir up people you don't know and you don't see. And you never talk to them. You can't stir anybody up. Can't do it. You got to be here. You got to be a part of it. And as you look at the world thinks this is nonsense. It's absolutely unnecessary. That's fine. You can have that belief, but you can't support that from the Bible. That's your belief. And you can't support that biblically. So we want to be people who keep the Sabbath and the holy days and realize that they are very important. The third definition of religious is to be scrupulously and conscientiously faithful, fervent and zealous. Let's go to Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19. And this is talking about a parable, and we'll look at verses 15 through 18. Luke 19, beginning in verse 15. It says, "And so it was then that when he had returned," so he's given out these minas, and he's gone away. Basically, he's given them to him and said, I want you to invest these. And when I come back, I want to see what you did with it. And when it comes down to us, what did God leave us? He left us minas. You say, well, I don't have any minas. Yeah, you do. You have something called the Holy Spirit. God gave you the Holy Spirit. And he's going to come back and he's going to say, what did you do with it? He's going to look, did you bear fruit? Did you bear fruit? And he asked that question here. He says in verse 15, "So it was when he returned, having received the kingdom, he then commanded these servants to whom he had given the money, the minas, to be called to him that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. So what did you do with it? Then came the first, saying, Master, your mina has earned 10 minas. And he said to him, Well done, good servant, because you were faithful in very little, have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, Master, your mina has earned 5 minas. So what's he telling them? He didn't give them that much. But he's saying, I gave you a little, and you took the little that I gave you, and you produced with it. And I can put 10 cities under your care, and I know that you will give them the same love and conscientious care that you used in developing the minas, helping to expand them, to bring a return. I know that you'll apply the same conscientiousness to those cities as you did the minas. That's what God's looking at. And all of us, as we made a commitment to God, God's saying, what are you going to do with it? What did you do with it? And there is a day when you're going to be accounted. There's a day of reckoning. And if you look at what's going on in the world, it's getting ever closer. The world isn't getting better. The world has some very serious problems, and how long it's going to take for that to play out, I don't know. But to me, I get the feeling it's kind of like a house of cards, and if you've ever built a house of cards, all you had to do is just touch it, and it just collapses, doesn't it? So I just think we're building the house higher, and how long will it go on? I don't know. So should we be scrupulously and conscientiously religious? Absolutely. What about being spiritual? So it's unquestioned that we should be religious. What about being spiritual? What about being spiritual? Let's look at a few scriptures. It's not just some nebulous thing. I feel I'm spiritual. I can hold my fingers in a certain way and I can chant mantras. That's not what it's about. What does it mean to be spiritual? Let's look. Let's go to Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Being spiritual is something that's obvious, something that should be observable. Galatians chapter 6, and Galatians 6 verse 1 gives us a specific thing to look at here. Galatians 6 verse 1, Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass. So if you know one of your fellow brethren has been overtaken in a trespass, in other words, they are sinning. And you know what sin is? You're able to discern that because you are a spiritual person. God's Spirit is working in you. And you know right from wrong. So you notice that they're trespassing. It says, you who are spiritual, you in whom God's Spirit is working. And you notice what went before here in chapter 5? What's he talking about? About the fruits of the Spirit. You in whom the fruits of the Spirit are working. You are spiritual. You are to restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Isn't that one of the fruits of the Spirit? Restore them in gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Not coming at them with this, I'm better than you. What are you, looking down on them, being arrogant? No, you come at them with a spirit of humility and gentleness, recognizing that you have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, but you, because you are your brother's keeper, say, you know what? This person needs help. And I, as a brother or sister in Christ, want the best for them. And I want them to be restored. I want them to understand the right path. He says in verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. God is saying here that those in the congregation who are led by God's Spirit should be spiritual people. Spiritual is not a feeling. Spirit produces fruit and is put on display by our actions. That we are spiritual people. Being religious has more to do with our outward expression. Spiritual has to do with our inner expression, what's going on inside. And if someone asks if we're spiritual, we ought to be able to answer yes and understand what that means. Colossians 1, verse 7. Colossians 1, verse 7. A little further on here in Paul's writings. Colossians chapter 1, verse 7. Paul says there, "As you also learned from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf, who also declared to us your love in the Spirit." So he's talking here about the way that we should be spiritual. Spiritual things are what goes on between the ears. And he says here that for this reason, we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask what you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. You pray for others and want God's Spirit to actively work in another person's life. What people see on the outside is the religious expression of that spirituality, that God is working in us and producing fruits. And all of those fruits that are found in Galatians 5, they're fruits. And, the apple tree does not eat the apples. Somebody comes up and picks that apple and eats it, doesn't it? And that's what we're to do. We're kind of like a tree. We bear fruit, and other people can come and pick of it and enjoy the fruits of that tree. So, spiritual growth through the Holy Spirit, through our relationship with the Father and Jesus Christ, develops us inside. God's laws are written in our hearts. And then religious expression is how that then comes out. And why do we help people? Why do we help people who are hurting? We do so because we're spiritual. We do so because we're religious. It's our religion to serve. It's our religion to help in that way. So somebody comes up to you and they say, "Are you religious?" How would you answer? I hope you'll answer yes, because you know what it means, and you know the scriptural guidelines that help us to understand what it means to be religious. And if they ask you, "Are you spiritual?" you say, "Yes, I am. Yes, I am, because God's Spirit dwells in me, the hope of glory. It works in me so that I can grow and come to the fullness of Christ." So hopefully we better understand the answer to the questions, are you religious or spiritual? They ask you both questions. The answer is yes.